You might be able to hear this in my voice in the episode that you're about to listen to, but I just got over either COVID or the flu. I'd been traveling way too much and I've been sleeping terribly, and it finally caught up to me. I've been home now for almost a week and I feel way better. And one thing that actually helped me feel a lot better is my 8-sleep. Before I had an 8-sleep, I never had the ability to change the temperature of my bed before, and I had no idea how much that affects and improves the quality of my sleep. I keep my 8-sleep ice cold. It's cold before I even get into bed. This helps me fall asleep faster and wake up less during the night. And when I had this fever and these flu-like symptoms, I kept it even colder, and it actually helped me recover from this sickness faster than if I didn't have an 8-sleep. I had been feeling terribly for a day or two before I got back home, and I was forced to sleep in a hotel bed that I cannot make cool, and I slept terribly. It was impossible for me not to notice my 8-sleep's absence, and I think that's a definition of a great product. A great product is when you notice its absence. There's a lot of founders that have actually spoken publicly about their love for 8-sleep. People like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg have both tweeted and posted publicly about the fact that they own and use and enjoy an 8-sleep mattress. I know Matteo, who is the founder of 8-sleep. Spent a bunch of time with him. We live in the same city. He listens to founders. I know he has a complete dedication to the constant improvement of his product. I believe that there are very few no-brainer investments in life, and 8-sleep is one of them. Normally, when you go to 8sleep.com/founders, you actually get $150 off. But right now, if you do this now, you get $500 off because 8-sleep is having a holiday sale. If you wanted to see why so many high-quality people are raving about 8-sleep, why I hate traveling without it, and you want to test it for yourself, now is the best time to do that. Get $500 off of your own 8-sleep by going to 8sleep.com/founders. Warren Buffett said Tom Murphy and Dan Burke were probably the greatest two-person combination in management that the world has ever seen or maybe ever will see. When he speaks to business school classes, Warren Buffett often compares the rivalry between Tom Murphy's company, Capital Cities Broadcasting, and CBS to a transatlantic race between a rowboat and the QE2. QE2 is the Queen Elizabeth II. It is this giant transatlantic liner, much, much larger than the Titanic. So he compares it to a transatlantic race between a rowboat and the QE2 to illustrate the tremendous effect management can have on long-term returns. When Murphy became the CEO of Capital Cities in 1966, CBS was the dominant media business in the country, with TV and radio stations in the country's largest markets, the top-rated broadcast network, and valuable publishing and music properties. In contrast, at that time, Capital Cities had 5 TV stations and 4 radio stations, all in small markets. CBS's market capitalization was 16 times the size of Capital Cities. But by the time Murphy sold his company to Disney 30 years later, Capital Cities was 3 times as valuable as CBS. In other words, the rowboat had won decisively. That is an excerpt from the book that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is The Outsiders, 8 Unconventional CEOs and Their Radically Rational Blueprint for Success. It was written by William Thorndike. And specifically, I'm going to focus on chapter 1, which is about Tom Murphy and Capital Cities Broadcasting. And the name of the chapter is A Perpetual Motion Machine for Returns. And before I do that, I'm going to actually put this book down for 1 second. I'm going to pick up last week's book, which was Ted Turner's autobiography, and read this section because he appears, Tom Murphy, and his partner, Dan Burke, appear in Ted Turner's autobiography as well, because they essentially built Capital Cities from a small broadcasting company into a multi-billion-dollar media conglomerate. And so this is what Ted Turner said about them. I like the Capital Cities people a lot. Dan Burke and Tom Murphy really understood the business. They had built their company up by buying TV and radio stations, as well as newspapers and magazines, and operating them efficiently. That is not the first time I read Tom Murphy's name in one of the books that I've covered for the podcast. All the way back on episode 286, I did an episode on Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger talk about Tom Murphy over and over again. They mention him in the shareholder letters. They mention him when they're answering the Q&As at their annual meeting. But this is what they said in the book, All I Want to Know Is Where I'm Going to Die, So I'll Never Go There, that I covered back on episode 286. This is Warren Buffett. He says, 40 years ago, Tom Murphy gave me one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received. He said, Warren, you can always tell someone to go to hell tomorrow. You haven't missed that opportunity. Just forget about it for a day. If you feel the same way tomorrow, then tell them that then, but don't spout off in a moment of anger. And just one more excerpt before we jump into the book. And this actually comes from the book called A Few Lessons from Warren Buffett. I covered it all the way back on episode 202. This is advice that Tom Murphy gave Warren Buffett on cost control. Cost control is something you and I are going to talk about a lot today. It's central to understanding Tom Murphy's incredible performance. This is what Warren Buffett says. 30 years ago, Tom Murphy drove this point home to me with a hypothetical tale about an employee who asked his boss for permission to hire an assistant. The employee assumed that adding $20,000 to the annual payroll would be inconsequential. But his boss told him that the proposal should be evaluated as a $3 million decision, given that an additional person would probably cost at least that amount over their lifetime, factoring in raises, benefits, and other expenses, down to the fact that the company would have to buy more toilet paper. This is how insane this guy paid attention to cost and efficiency. And unless the company fell on very hard times, the employee added would be unlikely to be dismissed, however marginal his contribution to the business. So as we go through this overview of Tom Murphy's life and his business philosophy, just remember that. He watched headcount like a hawk. So let's go back to the book, the chapter on Tom Murphy in The Outsiders. And it's going to pick up where we just left off, where Capital Cities winds up vastly outperforming over the 3 decades CBS. And like, okay, well, how does this happen? How did this seemingly insurmountable gap between these two companies get closed? So it says, the answer lies in fundamentally different management approaches. CBS spent much of the 1960s and 1970s taking the enormous cash flows generated by its network and broadcast operations and funding an aggressive acquisition program that led it into entirely new fields. So instead of focusing on other media properties, media business that they knew well, they bought things like a toy business, and they even bought the New York Yankees. They also would issue stock to fund some of these acquisitions. They're going to compare and contrast, obviously, the way CBS is being led under this guy named Bill Paley, who's actually the founder of CBS. I was reading about Bill Paley last week in the Ted Turner biography, or autobiography, and he mentioned Bill, so I actually went out and bought, and it's actually sitting on my desk right now. It's Bill's autobiography, which was published all the way back in 1979. So eventually I'm going to read it, and if it's good, I'll make a podcast on it. But let's go back to this. So they're getting into new fields that they don't know enough about. They're issuing shares. They're building a fancy headquarters in Midtown Manhattan at an enormous expense. And then they develop, now this is going to be maybe the largest contrast between CBS and Capital Cities. They develop a corporate structure, listen to this, with 42 presidents and vice presidents, and generally displayed what Charlie Munger calls a prosperity-blinded indifference to unnecessary costs. When I got to this section of the book, it made me think of one of my favorite things that that Munger says. They go and I think he was touring the Buffalo Evening News after they bought it, and Munger was really against spending money on luxurious offices, and so he has this great quip. He's like, "Why does a newspaper need a palace to publish in?" And so that's what I think of when they're describing what's going on here. The strategy at CBS was consistent with the conventional wisdom of the conglomerate era, which espoused the elusive benefits of, quote, diversification to justify the acquisition of unrelated businesses. At its core, CBS's strategy, implemented by Bill Paley, was focused on making CBS larger. So now they start contrasting that with Murphy's strategy for Capital Cities. In contrast, Murphy's goal was to make his company more valuable, not just larger, but more valuable. As he said to me, and so Thorndike is talking to him for this book, right? As he said to me, the goal is to not have the longest train, but to arrive at the station first using the least fuel. Murphy's got a bunch of good lines when he's talking to Thorndike. That's one of my favorite. The goal is to not have the longest train, but to arrive at the station first using the least fuel. And so as he continues to describe the difference in Murphy and Burke's strategy compared to CBS, I just jotted down a few notes on what was happening on this page for my own self. I just put, find your edge, don't diversify, and then repeat what works. Murphy and Burke rejected diversification and instead created an unusually streamlined conglomerate that focused laser-like on the media business that it knew well. Murphy acquired more radio and TV stations as opposed to buying the Yankees or a toy company, right? So he acquires more radio and TV stations, operated them superbly well, and regularly repurchased his shares. The formula that allowed Murphy to overtake Paley was deceptively simple. Number one, focus on industries with attractive economic characteristics. Number two, selectively use leverage to buy occasional large properties. Number three, improve operations. Number four, pay down debt. And number five, repeat this loop. More contrasting by Thorndike. What's interesting is that his peers at other media companies did not follow this path. They followed fashion and diversified into unrelated businesses. I'm going to pause in the middle of that sentence, actually, because when I got to that section, it made me think of something I read in Warren's Berkshire shareholder letters, where he says the behavior of peer companies will be mindlessly imitated. It's exactly what's happening in the book, right? They're just following fashion. What's really popular to do at the time, what every other people, other company, other conglomerates doing. They're going to diversify into unrelated businesses. They're going to build large corporate staffs, and they're going to overpay for marquee media properties. Obviously, he's setting that up for you and I to tell us that Murphy did the opposite. He did none of those things. Capital Cities under Murphy was an extremely successful example of what we would now call a roll-up. In a typical roll-up, a company acquires a series of businesses, attempts to improve operations, and then keeps acquiring, benefiting over time from scale advantages and best management practices. Now, just because it sounds simple does not mean it's easy. There's a lot of people, especially in the 90s and the 90s and the 2000s, that try to do this, and a lot of these companies that try to do a bunch of roll-ups wind up going out of business. And he talks a little bit about why this happened to them, and why it did not happen to Tom Murphy. A lot of these companies collapsed under the burden of too much debt. These companies typically failed because they acquired too rapidly and underestimated the difficulty of integrating acquisitions and improving operations. Murphy's approach to the roll-up was different. He moved slowly. He developed real operational expertise, which I think is one of the benefits of not diversifying, right? By the time he does his biggest acquisition, it's going to come 3 decades into his career. He's going to buy ABC with Warren Buffett's help. He can have real conviction. Do I actually have operational expertise in operating all these media properties? Well, let me look at the past 30 years. Did I do this correctly or not? And then he focused on a small number of large acquisitions that he knew to be high probability bets. Capital Cities combined excellence in both operations and capital allocation to an unusual degree. And that goes back to the start of the chapter, where Buffett's saying, Murphy and Burke are probably the greatest two-person combination ever. And it's this division of labor, the fact that Burke was the incredible operator, the one that rooted out all the inefficiencies, and then Murphy was the one that was capital allocator, focused on strategy and acquisitions, which we'll get to. And again, here's another great Murphyism, if you will. So he says, Capital Cities combined excellence in both operations and capital allocation to an unusual degree. As Murphy told me, this is great, this is excellent. The business of business is a lot of little decisions every day, mixed up with a very few big decisions. Okay, so let's go back in the timeline and figure out, how did Tom Murphy even get associated with Capital Cities to begin with? And really, the reason I'm highlighting this is because it speaks to the fact that one of the things you have to admire about Tom Murphy is that once he had conviction, he had no hesitancy about being bold. And you see that with the decision to take this job in the first place. So he graduates from Harvard Business School, and he gets a job, just a normal job. He's working for Lever Brothers, which is this massive consumer packaged goods company at the time. He goes to this event at his parents' house, and he meets this guy named Frank Smith. And Smith begins to tell him about Smith's latest venture, which is he bought a struggling TV station. This is before cable. Just like if you listen to last week, this is the early days of cable. This is very similar to the early days of Ted Turner's career. That's why I think it's so interesting to do this podcast right after the last one. So Smith buys this. He buys a struggling TV station, and he purchases it out of bankruptcy. And before the evening was over, Murphy had agreed to leave his job in New York City and relocate to Albany to run the TV station. Now, here's the crazy thing. He had no broadcast experience, nor did he have any kind of management experience of any kind. At this point, Tom Murphy is 29 years old. Tom is going to turn around this station. It's going to take him 3 years. So the station has a bunch of operating losses, obviously, because it was bought out of bankruptcy, right? So he ends up turning it into a consistent cash generator by improving programming and then aggressively managing costs. That's going to come up over and over and over again. Aggressively managing costs, as you can imagine, when he's giving advice to Warren Buffett. By the way, Warren Buffett says that Tom Murphy was one of his heroes, that Tom Murphy made him a better person, and that Actually, that is the ultimate gift you can give to somebody by helping them become a better person. So you can imagine if he's giving Warren Buffett advice, saying that don't think about hiring another person just as like a $20,000 thing. Like thinking about it all, like how much you're gonna pay more over a decade, all the other stuff that comes with employee, down to the amount of toilet paper that person's gonna use in the office. I think that that's an understatement. Aggressively managing costs, right? So it says this was a formula that the company would apply repeatedly in the years ahead. In 1957, so this is now 3 years later, Smith and Murphy buy a second TV station. Then shortly thereafter, they buy a third TV station, and then they change the name of the company to Capital Cities. Now, the third TV station is important because this is when Murphy hires a young 30-year-old with also no broadcast experience as his replacement to run the Albany station. That is Dan Burke. Dan Burke and Tom Murphy are going to be this dynamic duo, these partners for the next 30 years. So Murphy spends time training Burke, and he says he quickly indoctrinated Burke into the company's lean, decentralized operating philosophy. Then Murphy moves back to New York to work with Smith to build the company through acquisition. So that is how Capital Cities is going to grow. It grows by selectively acquiring additional radio and television stations. Now, here's what happens. Smith unexpectedly dies in 1966. By this time, Smith and Murphy had been working together for 11 years. So that means at 40 years old, after Smith's death, Murphy becomes CEO. And that's the position he's going to hold until he sells it to Disney. So at the time he takes over the company, they have revenue of just $28 million. Murphy's first move as CEO, he's like, okay, I'm going to elevate Burke to the role of president and chief operating officer. And this was an excellent selection of a partner because they have essentially opposite skill sets and they have a very clear division of labor. And so this is a description of their excellent partnership and who did what. Burke was responsible for daily management of operations and Murphy for acquisitions and capital allocation. As Burke told me, our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect. I had an appetite for and a willingness to do things that Murphy was not interested in doing. Burke believed his job was to create the free cash flow, and Murphy's job was to spend it. So by this time, Capital City owns 5 different TV stations. That was the maximum allowed by the FCC. So there's a regulation on the books at the time. You cannot own more than 5. So it's like, okay, well, we're not going to stop growing. What are we going to do? It says they next turned their attention to newspaper publishing, which, as an advertising-driven business with attractive margins and strong competitive barriers, had close similarities to the broadcasting business. So that's another example of him deviating from what other people building conglomerates were doing at this time. He's like, well, I just want to stick to these businesses that are very similar to each other that I know very well. And so after buying a bunch of newspapers, he's like, well, what other businesses are very similar to the ones I already own? Eventually, this regulation is going to be lifted. But before that happens, he's like, well, there's this new invention, which we talked about last week, which is cable television. Okay, well, that looks very similar to the broadcast TV stations I own. And then some of these newspapers that I own, they're advertising-driven businesses with attractive margins. Let me go ahead and buy a cable television business. And this was one of the most fascinating things about the Ted Turner autobiography is the fact that Ted Turner was one of the first people in the broadcast TV industry to actually embrace cable. There's a maxim here that this is not a threat, it's an opportunity. Every other broadcaster besides Ted Turner, and now we see Tom Murphy as well, thought about cable as, oh my God, this is a threat to my broadcast business. They both Turner and Murphy thought it's like, no, it's not a threat, it's an actual opportunity. And they also understood it as a better product offering. Like the genie's out of the bottle. Like there's nothing you're going to do. Like you might as well go with the technology that enables you to just reach a much larger market than somebody watching like a local or regional TV station. And then it goes into another strategy that he used that was quite different. During the extended bear market of the mid-1970s to early 1980s, Murphy became an aggressive purchaser of his own shares. He eventually bought back close to 50% of his outstanding shares, most of it at single-digit price-to-earnings multiples. In 1984, the FCC relaxed its station ownership rules, and Murphy, in his masterstroke, bought the ABC network. So the note I left myself here is this is something that comes up over and over again in these books. Stay in the game long enough to get lucky. This is the most important thing that he does in his entire business career, and it happens 30 years into his career. So he buys ABC Network for nearly $3.5 billion with financing from his friend Warren Buffett. The ABC deal was the largest non-oil and gas transaction in business history to that point, and an enormous bet. This is what I meant about him being able to be bold when he has real conviction. And an enormous bet the company transaction for Murphy, representing over 100% of Capital Equity's enterprise value at the time. So the Wall Street Journal reported on this transaction with the headline, "The Minnow Swallows the Whale." And then Murphy's partner, Burke, said at the time that this is the acquisition that I've been training for my entire life. So why would Murphy bet the entire company on one transaction? It says Murphy's conviction was that he can improve the margins of ABC's TV stations from the low 30s up to Capital City's industry-leading levels of margins of 50+%. Oh my God, check this out. Under Burke's oversight, the staff that oversaw ABC's TV station group dropped from 60 to 8 people. The margin gap was closed in just 2 years. So in 2 years, they brought ABC's margins from 30% to over 50. A story from this time demonstrates the culture clash between the network executives and the leaner, more entrepreneurial acquirers. ABC was a limousine culture. Executives had the habit of taking a limo for even a few blocks to go to lunch. Murphy, however, was a cab man. Before long, Murphy's practice of taking cabs everywhere instead of a limo, or for God's sakes, you should walk a few blocks. Come on, stop being lazy. Before long, this practice of taking cabs rippled through the ABC executive ranks. When asked whether this was a case of leading by example, Murphy responded, "Is there any other way?" Capital Cities never made another large-scale acquisition after the ABC